All right, I think we should get started. I want to welcome everybody to our continuing series on the extraordinary genius of George Washington and the role that he played in shaping the founding years of our infant republic. I want to turn it over to Bob fairly quickly, but I just want to locate tonight's discussion in the context of where we stand in history, very, very briefly, because clearly we're in the middle of a great transformation. As a number of people, including the senator from Missouri, Josh Hawley, has said, the old Republican Party is dead. And it's clearly upon us to create the conditions for a new Republican Party, which is very much under the leadership of Donald Trump. And I think what Bob is going to go through tonight is an extremely important historical discussion of the only way that you can actually approach such a moment of change. And that is from the standpoint of principles. When you're in a period of this kind of transition, the issue is not some aggregation of issues or even policies, as important as they may be. You really do have to go back to the question of principle. And the principal difference between what drove the American Revolution and how the French Revolution was used as essentially a battering ram against the principles of the American Revolution is extraordinarily important for the moment that we're in right now. So I don't want to delay the discussion any further. I want to turn it over to Bob and let him take it away.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Nice to be here again tonight. What I'm going to be discussing tonight is almost entirely going to be focused on the French Revolution and what happened in France. Next week, I will be discussing how this then affected the fight within the United States and led to a very intensive effort, which very few people today realize, to destroy and bring down the Washington administration. But tonight the discussion will be on France. Now, just to add a little bit to Susan's introduction, here we are. Trump just announced for president. We just had the election. A special prosecutor, or wherever he's called, has been named to investigate Trump. We're in a very intensive situation. So some people might be asking themselves, why the hell are we spending a Saturday evening discussing the French Revolution? Well, there's two reasons. Well, there's several reasons, but two of them are, first of all, this has been an ongoing discussion for those who have followed some of it or all of it, of George Washington, his military leadership, his role in creating the Constitution, and now we're into his presidency, which I've been discussing the last 2 weeks, and the economic policies of the Washington presidency. What we have been discussing is the creation of the American Republic. And you cannot really understand what was going on at that period, during that period, and in the Washington presidency in those years, without recognizing the importance of what was going on in France. So we have to discuss it. It's also the case that here we are today in the middle of a revolution, This is what we are organizing, a revolution. Um, and this is what Trump is leading. That's why he's being attacked, and there's every effort in the world to prevent him from serving another term, because the oligarchy, the financial establishment, are terrified of a second Trump presidency. It is a revolutionary moment, and when you are in that kind of a moment, you have to know what the hell you're doing. It's not a protest movement. It's a movement to create a republic, or in our case today, to recreate the American republic, grounded in the principles upon which it was created in the first place. And you have to think through what those principles are, what that means in terms of policy, such as national banking. And you have to educate yourself, in these matters. So this is how we're going to proceed. Now, I will say that this is going to be perhaps a difficult class for some people, because we're going to be dealing with subject matters which are not widely known. It's not going to be a lot of dates and all of that. A lot of it is going to deal with certain principles and ideas as to how society should be organized. And it's going to deal with a lot of French personalities who people will probably not be familiar with, or at least some people will not be familiar with. So, it's going to require some patience, some effort, and I hope people will stick with it as we proceed. I do want to make one sort of apology at the beginning, which is there are a lot of French names in this material. And I am almost certain to mispronounce some of these. So for those of you who are fluent in French, you will forgive me. So I'm going to put up a graphic, but before I do that, I want to just tell people what it is, or I'll describe it when the graphic gets put up. But, a lot of people today, a lot of people don't know much about history from 200 or 300 or 400 years ago. And they tend to think, well, there was the American Revolution, and this was followed by the French Revolution. Now, that's not really true, because if you're looking at the period of 1775 to 1796 as one continuing revolution under George Washington's leadership in terms of the creation of the American Republic, it is important to recognize that the Washington presidency, the 8 years that George Washington served as president of the United States, occurred simultaneously with the French Revolution. Susan, can you put that little picture up? Yeah, as you see here, on the top left, that's a picture of George Washington. And you see his inauguration, April 30th, 1789, and then his farewell address, September 19th, 1796. Now, below that, on the bottom left, there's another individual, and that is Maximilien Robespierre, who was the leader of France during the Reign of Terror, sent people to the guillotine. And on the right, you see some dates from the French Revolution. This tennis court oath was June 20th, 1789. That's only 51 days after Washington's inauguration. 51 days after Washington's inauguration is the tennis court oath, which initiated the French Revolution. And that was followed, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later by the storming of the Bastille. And then Thermidor. And Thermidor is the date given for the coup d'etat in which Robespierre and his ally, Saint-Just, were overthrown and executed. And ending the reign of terror. Of course, the French Revolution continued under what was called the Directory, but that's a certain, important point of reference there. And that was on November 19, 1795, which is about 10 months before Washington's farewell address. So from Washington's inauguration to his farewell address, and from the tennis court oath to Thermidor, this is all occurring at the same time. And we will get into some of this next week in terms of the implications of this for what happened in America, which were, quite far-reaching. But tonight we're going to focus on France. So you could take that down, Susan. All right. Now, look, there are the sort of a commonplace view is that the French Revolution was a failed American revolution. They tried to carry out an American revolution and it failed. Now, that's just a really bad way. It's a very flawed, view of the French Revolution. And there are several things to consider. I mean, first of all, the French Revolution was not an attempt to create an American revolution in France. The entire project was organized in London, and it was part of a multifaceted operation to destroy France. France was the primary rival of the British Empire. People know France had helped us in the Revolutionary War, but look, France had more people than Great Britain. It was the most populous nation in Europe. France was also the most advanced industrial nation in Europe, more advanced than Great Britain. For those who think that the Industrial Revolution only happened in Great Britain, France was more advanced industrially, scientifically, technologically. And France was the most powerful nation on the European continent. Following the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, the British became obsessed with destroying France as their rival. And in fact, between 1763 and 1789, including during the Revolutionary War, but it particularly escalated after the Revolutionary War, between 1783 and 1789, the British, together with their allies in Amsterdam and several other locations like Geneva, waged intensive economic and financial warfare against France to bankrupt the monarchy, to bankrupt the French nation, to plunge it into chaos, and a lot of people will tell you today that the cause of the French Revolution was the massive impoverishment of the French people. When Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake" and all of that, because there was no bread, there was no food, they were starving to death. Well, obviously, that created the conditions for the violent revolution. But that poverty and the economic breakdown of France, yes, they had bad policies governing France, economic policies, but this was all a product of massive financial warfare by the London-based banks, the Amsterdam-based banks, and several other locations. This became worse when a man named Jacques Necker became the finance minister in France, because Necker was his policies were such, they were intended to undermine the monarchy, to weaken and bring down the monarchy. So Necker was from Geneva, Genevan banker, but he became the finance minister of France. He was a fifth columnist. He was an operative of the financial oligarchy within France, who was actually acting against the monarchy and the French nation. And then the third thing to recognize is that the French Revolution was not a continuation of the American Revolution or an attempt to replicate the American Revolution. The French Revolution, from the beginning, from the tennis court oath, the French Revolution was intended not only to destroy France, but then to be used to destroy the republic that Washington and Hamilton were building in the United States. And as I said, we'll discuss that next week. But this was the intention from the beginning. Now, people say, there are some people who've studied this period who say, what about Lafayette? Wasn't he trying to create an American Revolution? What about Sylvan Bailey? Wasn't he trying to create an American Revolution? And for those who don't know who Sylvan Bailey was, he was the mayor of Paris. He was an astronomer, a scientist, and he was a very close ally of Lafayette's. And the answer to that is simple. Yes, they were trying to create an American Revolution. But as Gouverneur Morris repeatedly warned Lafayette that this could not work, that the conditions did not exist to do it, that France was not America, and that this would end in disaster. And secondly, the fact is that Lafayette and Bailey were never in control. They were never in control. They did not start the revolution, and they were never in control of the revolution. They were trapped within a much larger dynamic, which was based in philosophical and cultural axioms that were absolutely alien to everything the American Revolution had stood for. So we'll get into a little bit more of that. But as I said, a lot of people today, the commonplace view is that the French Revolution failed. But for those who've been to, highfalutin universities, or maybe any university, I don't know what they teach in some of these schools today. But if you go to places like Ivy League universities, or if you go to Europe, to Oxford, to Cambridge, other schools, you get a much different view that's put forward. And you can read the articles and read the things that people have written who are these accredited professors at these universities. And their view is that it was the French Revolution, not the American Revolution, which was the true revolution, which was, in fact, the successful revolution eventually. But that the American Revolution, as some people actually say outright, the American Revolution was not really a revolution at all. That it was a colonial revolt, that the colonies were being mistreated. They revolted against, their imperial master. They gained independence, but all that they really achieved was separation. It was a colonial revolt that achieved separation from Great Britain, but that it did not overturn the axioms or ruling structures of society. Therefore, it wasn't a true revolution. But that the French Revolution, on the other hand, destroyed the existing social fabric, brought down the ruling institutions, and brought in new notions of culture and government that revolutionized society. And therefore, the French Revolution was the historic revolution which changed everything. Now, from the standpoint of the oligarchy, that's true. It's a complete misreading of the American Revolution, obviously. But in terms of what they're saying about the French Revolution, it's true. As one person who I read put it, he said the French Revolution, quote, cleared the way for a new type of society, unquote. And this is what you see if you go into, as you proceed, say after 1815. 1815 was the Treaty of Vienna, which ended the Napoleonic Wars. And as you proceed from 1815 through the 19th century, all the way through the 19th century, you see the axioms, you see the scientific and cultural principles of the French Revolution essentially marching through the institutions of Europe. Now, a lot of people say, well, after 1815, there was this real right-wing reaction, the Holy Alliance, and brutal anti-democratic, policies were imposed, which spread pessimism all over Europe. Now, there's a lot of truth in that. That's certainly the case. But look at the underlying thing that was unleashed by the French Revolution, which eventually became hegemonic. This is what we're going to go into tonight, because this is what you see. As the 19th century develops, and as you move through the 19th century, you have the Romanticism. You have going into the 20th century, the existentialism, which poisoned the minds of the baby boomer generation in the 1960s and 70s. You have all of these things. And this is all an assault on the, really, it's an assault on the Renaissance concept of man. Look, for instance, the French Revolution is known, one of the things it's famous for is the assault on the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was almost annihilated. The churches were seized, the property was seized, thousands and thousands of priests, nuns, and bishops were executed, guillotined, hung, what have you. It was almost wiped out, at least for a period of time. But this was not an assault on the Catholic Church per se. It was, or an assault on organized religion. What was under assault was the Renaissance concept of man made in the image of God. And the same thing is true with an assault on Renaissance science, and we'll get into some of that. But the idea of man made in the image of God, the idea that the human being is has a creative identity, is capable of making discoveries, that the human being is fundamentally different from animals, that the primary characteristic of the human being, moral characteristic, is agape, love of God, love of other human beings, because of our shared identity as being creatures based with human reason. This is the Renaissance concept. This is what you see in the Renaissance. And this was all brought down by the French Revolution. And this then leads into everything you see in the 19th century. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go into some of what you could call the philosophical roots of the French Revolution, and then we'll take a look at what was going on in France itself. And as I said, this is a little theoretical, little challenging, but hopefully people will find it useful. Now, most people have probably heard at least the term, and maybe they know a lot more about it than just the term, but the term the Enlightenment, or the European Enlightenment. Today what they will teach you in college is that the European Enlightenment, which really began, if you want to give it a date, in the late 17th century, but then really emerged in the 18th century. And what you will learn in college today is that the European Enlightenment was the lawful successor of the Renaissance. That you had the Renaissance in the 15th and early 16th century, and that this then led into the Enlightenment, and that the Enlightenment, ushered in an era of, what's called modern scientific method, as well as democratic ideals. This has been glorified by a lot of historians. I mean, there was one historian who was very well known at one time. He was, very popular at one time, named Will Durant, and he wrote this several volume history of European civilization, and he wrote a whole volume on the Enlightenment, and he called it The Age of Reason. That was the title of that book. And that's generally how it's viewed, that this was the flowering of science, of democratic ideals, and all of these things. But the reality is that it was the opposite. If you look at Renaissance science, it has a long history, but it begins to reach its apex with Filippo Brunelleschi, the creator of the Dome of Florence, Nicholas of Cusa and his writings, like on learned ignorance, Leonardo da Vinci, and not only his scientific work, but his work on perspective and painting. And then Johannes Kepler with his examination of the solar system. This is Renaissance science. Now, what happened, if you want to get into this question of the Enlightenment, is that you have to go back to late 16th century and early 17th century Venice. In Venice at that time, this is the Venetian Empire. And remember, this is the financial center of Europe at that time. The Bank of Venice, which you can't really call it a central bank, but it was the model for what became central banking. The Bank of Venice was the first central banking type bank, and the Bank of Venice became the model for the Bank of Amsterdam and then the Bank of London. You have, the emergence of a financial oligarchy, an oligarchical state run by the financiers in Venice at that time. And one of the most important leaders of Venice as this maritime financial empire, is coming into existence. One of the major leaders of Venice was a man named Paolo Sarpi, who was a monk, but he was also much more than just a monk. He was a scientist, a mathematician. He wrote extensively, and he built up a wide circle of followers and allies. And Sarpi developed, you could say he invented, although he didn't really invent it, but he developed an extensive theory of what he called empiricism. And what this was based on was the idea that all that you could know, the only thing that a human being could know, was through their sense perception. Touching, feeling, seeing, hearing. You only know what your senses tell you. And there is no higher cognitive power or no higher principles by which you can make judgments of what your senses tell you. And the simultaneous, or as part of this science of empiricism, Sarpi also wrote extensively on mathematics. He was a mathematician. That was actually probably one of the main things he was known for during his lifetime. And he developed extensively linear mathematics. And so you have an empirical method and a method of linear mathematics by which you take in things through your senses, and then you analyze and judge and arrange this sense perception using linear mathematical methods to tell you what's going on, and by which you make judgment. Now, why is this important? It's important because what it leaves out is human creativity. What it leaves out is the idea of the human being made in the image of the Creator. You know, people say the man in the image of God, but it's man in the image of the Creator. And as in the image of the Creator, we are capable of creativity. We are capable of discovering principles, not sensory data, like empiricism says, but principles by which the universe is governed. And Sarpi denied all of that. He denied that higher universal principles exist. He denied that creative thought exists. You know, he was what you could call a radical materialist, that we only know what we can see, hear, touch, and smell, and we can only then arrange that data, add and subtract that data based on linear mathematical methods. That's all we're capable of, and we know nothing else. Now, what Sarpi did is he developed an extensive network of proteges, allies, followers all over Europe. And, you know, while he was alive, many of these people were in direct correspondence with him, like Francis Bacon in England, who carried out years-long correspondence, letters back and forth with Sarpi in Venice from England. But he developed a whole network of people in Europe. And this included people like Galileo, Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, John Locke. Newton came a little later, but not that much later. And you know, these people were all students of Sarpi, and they all accepted his scientific method of empiricism. And all of these people were enemies of Renaissance science, as we see later, with the attacks on Leibniz by many of these empiricists, or the attacks on Kepler by Galileo. Galileo was actually paid money by Sarpi to attack Johannes Kepler. Galileo was on Sarpi's payroll in Venice when he attacked Kepler. You know, because the difference between the two, you know, I mean, this is really simplified, okay? I'm oversimplifying. But if you look at Galileo, what did he do? He said, I'm going to use my senses. I'm going to observe the heavens in a telescope, which he didn't even build. I'm going to observe the heavens, and I'm going to write down the data that I see. And then I am going to use linear methods to compute this data. You're making observations of data. That's what Galileo did. Kepler, who invented his own telescope, very advanced telescope, investigated the heavens and asked himself the question, what are the universal principles behind the motion of the planets and the stars? What are the principles which are governing the solar system and the universe? That's the difference, right? And, people might say, well, why is this important? Well, because if you're an empiricist, your outlook is that human beings are no better than animals. Like animals, we can, all we know is what we see, hear, touch, feel, and smell. Like animals, we have no understanding of the principles of the universe. Like animals, we cannot make hypotheses. We can only compute data. We cannot create. We are just like animals. We're beasts. And therefore it is no coincidence at all that if you look at how this empiricist network evolved and spread, and this is what became known as the Enlightenment. And if you look at how it spread and where the centers of it were, the centers of the Enlightenment were in the oligarchical banking capitals, right? In Amsterdam, with the Bank of London, with people like Descartes and Isaac Beeckman, the mathematician. In Paris, with the Mersenne Circle and other people. In London, with all the stuff in London. The Bank of London, the Bank of, Amsterdam, the circles in Paris. And then there were other centers like Geneva, but it's within the imperial oligarchical banking centers that you see the emergence of the so-called Enlightenment, right? This is not an age of reason, right? This is oligarchical ideology, which denies, the sacredness of the human being, the creativity of the human being, and which is, which is all being promulgated under oligarchical rule. Now, in France, the people who were sort of part of the Enlightenment became known as the philosophes, and I might be mispronouncing that. And, if you look at the period in the 1750s, 60s, 70s, 80s, in the immediate decades leading up to the French Revolution, these Enlightenment circles were totally dominant over the intellectual culture in France, in Paris in particular. Now, they didn't all agree with each other on everything. They would attack each other, they would plagiarize from each other, but they were all empiricists, every one of them. And this included, just to name a few, people like Voltaire, a man named Emmanuel Sayé, who I'm going to say more about, Etienne Dumont, Baron Tolbach, Diderot, Rousseau, Helvetius, D'Alembert, Montesquieu, Quesnay, and many, many others. But this was the intellectual ruling class of France in the decades leading up to the French Revolution. And they were very much, there was an interchange or, very intimate relations between the Parisian circles and people in London and elsewhere. Voltaire, for instance, spent 2.5 years in England, where he became a devout follower of Isaac Newton and actually attended Newton's funeral. And then later, he actually wrote a work on Newton entitled Elements of the Philosophy of Newton. Adam Smith, the anti-American proponent of free trade, stole almost all of his ideas on free trade from Quesnay and Turgot and the who were the what were called French physiocrats and leaders of the economic thinking within the French Enlightenment. If you read many of these French authors, Rousseau and others, many of them, Montesquieu, they're unrestrained in their praise of John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and then later Jeremy Bentham was on intimate terms with many of these people in Paris. So this is the circle, this is the grouping, who are the intellectual leaders of France going into 1789. And of course, this is far, far different than what had existed in the United States in 1775. Now, how did this, look, the fact is they controlled this thing from the beginning, from the very beginning. You can look at two of the most famous documents of the French Revolution, maybe the two most famous documents of the French Revolution. One is called the Tennis Court Oath, and the other is called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, right? Now, both of these documents were written by Emmanuel Sayé. He wrote the Tennis Court Oath outright. And then as for the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the original draft was co-written by Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson. But then Sayé rewrote it, and he wrote the final version of it. So he authored both of these documents. Now, I already mentioned Sayé as one of these French philosophes, but who was he? Who is this guy? He was called the Abbé Sayé. Well, he was educated at the Sorbonne. He was a devout follower of John Locke, Etienne Condé, and Condé was perhaps the most fierce critic of Gottfried Leibniz in France, even more so than Voltaire. So John Locke, Etienne Condé, the elder Mirabeau, Rousseau, Quesnay, these are the people he studied, that Sayé studied. These are the people he references in his writings. He is a follower of the ideas of all of these people. Locke, Rousseau, and the rest of them. Now, what I would urge people to do, if you feel so inclined, is to actually read the Declaration of the Rights of Man, because this is, sort of put forward by people who are pro-French Revolution as France's, the equivalent of the American Declaration of Independence. And you can read it. I mean, it's readily available online, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which was 1789. And you read it, it bears no resemblance to the US Declaration of Independence at all. It defines a society based entirely on really what you could call a paranoid view of human nature, sort of Thomas Hobbes on steroids. I'll just read you a couple of short quotes. In Article 2, the Declaration says, "The aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural rights of man. These are liberty, property, safety, and resistance to oppression." And resistance to oppression is a major theme in all of these writings. Liberty, property, safety, and resistance to oppression. And then in Article 4, it says, liberty consists in being able to do anything that does not harm others. right? A view, I guess, today you see in the libertarians. Liberty consists in, the right to do anything you want as long as it doesn't harm others. Now, we've been through a lot of classes on Washington and Hamilton. I did previous classes on Abraham Lincoln. And, I would ask people to reflect on this. The idea that this is a direct quote from the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Liberty consists in being able to do anything that does not harm others. And I would ask you, is that the concept of liberty that drove George Washington at Valley Forge? Is that the concept of liberty upon which, Abraham Lincoln staked his life? Was that what they viewed liberty was? I don't think so. But this is what is openly declared. And then if you go on from the Declaration of the Rights of Man, about a month after that was written, the National Assembly of France, the Revolutionary National Assembly, actually, I guess it was more than a few months later, but they adopted the Constitution of 1791, and this was the first written French Constitution. And again, it bears no resemblance whatsoever to the U.S. Constitution. It's not just, the structure of it is completely different. It's a parliamentary system with a national assembly, and everything is different. But the philosophy of it, the morals of it, are entirely at odds with the U.S. Constitution. If you and again, you can get this online. The French Constitution of 1791. You can read it. And essentially, it's a laundry list of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. This is permitted. This is not permitted. The government can do this. The government can't do that. The citizen can do this. The citizen can't do that. It's a mathematical laundry list of do's and don'ts. And there is no higher principle and no intention within that Constitution, enunciated within that Constitution. And what you get the sense of when you read this Constitution of 1791 is you get the sense, what comes across is sort of an image of an impersonal state, sort of like a shepherd herding sheep, herding animals. This is allowed, that's allowed, don't go there, sheep, don't go there, you're allowed to do this. This is what you get, but there is no higher intention because there is no higher conception of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a citizen. There's no conception. We've been discussing Hamilton and Washington's economic policies, and these don't exist in the French Constitution. If you look at everything we discussed over the last several weeks about what Washington and Hamilton were doing to build the nation, to advance it, the productivity of the nation, to advance the science of the nation, to advance the conditions of the population, none of that is there. It's all about, how you prescribe certain rights and certain prohibitions and what have you. It's completely alien to the outlook of the American Revolution in every way. Now, I want to mention a few people, but I think look, you have Mirabeau. He was one of the major leaders at the beginning of the Revolution. What's more interesting is his father, Mirabeau Sr., who was the Marquis de Mirabeau, who died one day before the storming of the Bastille, because Mirabeau Sr. was the co-founder, together with Quesnay, of the Physiocratic School, economic school, in France. And this was the school, among other things, of radical free trade. And in terms of Mirabeau, who was, again, between 1789, 1790, going into 91, he was really the leader, the most prominent leader of the French Revolution in its first stage. Now, he had spent years in England. He had lived at Lord Shelburne's estate. We discussed Lord Shelburne last week, and we're going to discuss him a little bit more here. He lived at Lord Shelburne's estate, the Bowood estate. He became extremely close to Jeremy Bentham, and really the partner of Bentham and sort of the deployable agent of Lord Shelburne. You have another guy by the name of Baron d'Holbach, who was very prominent, not very well known today, but he wrote a book called in 1770, The System of Nature, which became known as the Bible of excuse me, the Bible of atheism. And he ran the most important, if you think of these Venetian salons, he ran the most important intellectual salon in Paris by far. He was extremely wealthy. And he had meetings twice a week in his home for years. And, regulars at these meetings were Condorcet, D'Alembert, Turgot, Helvetius, Rousseau, many visitors from England, including Adam Smith, David Humes, Edward Gibbon, and others. He was a radical materialist, radical empiricist, atheist, and he had enormous influence on people like Marat and how do you pronounce it? Desmoulins, and other Jacobin leaders. In many ways, he was a lot more influential than Voltaire among the empiricist network in France. Another person was Etienne Dumont, and he was another French philosopher, so-called, who lived at for extended times, who lived at Lord Shelburne's estate in England, and he became the French editor of the collected writings of Jeremy Bentham. And actually in 1788, Shelburne sent Dumont, together with a guy named Romilly, who was a British guy. Shelburne sent Dumont and Romilly to Paris to meet with Lafayette, to discuss with Lafayette what needed to be done in Paris. And this meeting took place at the home of Malesherbes, who was another one of these characters, another one of these French empiricists. And then the last one I'll just mention is Rousseau. I mean, there's so many of these people, but I want to mention Rousseau. He's perhaps one of the most famous, not the most important, but I want to mention him just for one reason, because he had a big influence on Robespierre and on the people around Robespierre, and Rousseau is, he put forward this idea. He wrote a book called The Social Contract, in which he discusses the question of man and the state of nature. Now, I don't want to oversimplify. I mean, it's a whole book, right? I don't want to oversimplify it, but I've read chunks of it, I not from beginning to end, but good chunks of it. And really what he puts forward there is all taken directly, without attribution, but it's all taken directly from John Locke. If you read John Locke's two treatises of government, where he discusses this question of natural freedom, that man is born into a state of nature like a pig or a donkey or a giraffe. But then as man enters into society, he surrenders some of his natural rights so that he can live together in society, right? This is what they call the social contract. And he still remains an animal. He's just an animal, but he has agreed to give up some of his natural freedoms so that he can live in, in society with everyone else, right? And this is all in John Locke, but it's repeated in Rousseau, and Rousseau really repeats it, not verbatim, but the argument is identical to Locke's argument. And this is what you see. Now look, I mean, the fact is that Lafayette was surrounded by these people, surrounded by them on every side. I mean, the way, in a letter that Gouverneur Morris wrote to George Washington in 1790, Morris was in Paris, and he says, this unhappy country, bewildered in pursuit of metaphysical whimsies, presents to our moral view a mighty ruin. And I could go on because it's a very moving letter, but this is how Morris described it in his own way, his own sort of way of phrasing it. Bewildered by metaphysical whimsies, Morris had no hope that the revolution could possibly succeed, and predicted that it would go through a period of intense bloodshed and anarchy and culminate in a dictatorship. And he predicted that very early. And then I'll give you a quote, which may seem cruel, but, Gouverneur Morris was not known for, pulling his punches. He in 1792, after Lafayette fled France, because he would have been arrested and executed at that point in 1792, after Lafayette fled France and went over to the Austrian lines, where he was arrested and imprisoned, Gouverneur Morris wrote a letter to Washington and said to Washington, quote, "Thus Lafayette's circle is completed. He has spent his fortune on a revolution and is now crushed by the wheel which he put in motion. He lasted longer than I expected." That's how Gouverneur Morris put it. Oh man, whoa. Well, I was going to go into a whole thing about Lord Shelburne and the Bowood Circle, but this included not only these people from France like Mirabeau and others, but people from in England, like David Hume and a guy named Etienne Claver and a number of other people, out of which he's running operations, and deploying people continually into Paris, into France, and they just give you a sense of this, because if you want to understand it, what's the real difference here? You have the U.S. Declaration of Independence in July 4th, 1776. A few months later, in October of 1776, Jeremy Bentham, who is Lord Shelburne's protege, Jeremy Bentham wrote a letter in which he was actually contemptuous of the American Declaration of Independence. He said in the letter, quote, "This they hold to be a truth self-evident, that is, that all men are created equal. At the same time, to secure these rights, they are satisfied that government should be instituted. They see not that nothing that was ever called government ever was or ever could be exercised, but at the expense of one or another of these rights. That some one or other of those pretended inalienable rights is alienated." See, do you see the difference here? I hope so. that we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, and that we are instituting a government to defend and protect these rights. Bentham says that that's the opposite is true. That our rights, as John Locke says, as Rousseau said, our rights come not from God. Our rights come from being born as an animal in nature. But then government takes away those rights, right? This is the difference here, right? A fundamental difference. And then in 1780, Bentham authored Principles of Morals and Legislation, in which he says, quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters." So we're mankind, we're under the governance of two sovereign masters. What are those masters? Bentham says, two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. Every effort we make to throw off our subjugation will serve only to demonstrate and confirm it. The principle of utility recognizes this subjugation and assumes it for the foundation. That's our masters, two masters, pain and pleasure, like an animal, right? We know pain, we know pleasure. We choose between the two. This is the outlook. This is the outlook of Bentham. This is the outlook of, Adam Smith. And this is the outlook of all of the Enlightenment creatures swarming around Lafayette, and the people who created, the French Revolution, of Sayé, who wrote the Tennis Court Oath and the Declaration on the Rights of Man. This is the outlook. Man is an animal. I have a section here on Jefferson and Morris, in America, but I think I'll save that for next week. And look, another point I want to make, and I think I'll save that too. I just don't have enough time to go through all this, and I can get to some of this next week, or not? Yeah, next week. When we're discussing America, what was going on in America, because I have some things on Hamilton, some things on Jefferson, but I could put that off to next week. So let me just end with this. Another thing to consider is the following. We're talking here about, empiricism, the oligarchy, imperial finance, reflect on where we are today with the central banking system. Reflect on the absolutely satanic, evil notion they have of human beings. Now, one of the things that occurred in France as a result of the French Revolution and everything that came afterwards was that France was integrated into the central banking system that Europe, that the British were setting up. Beginning with Louis XI, going back to the 15th century, down through, all the way through Louis XIV, who had a lot of problems, but with Colbert and others, you had a powerful central state in which government finance was really under the control of the government. Now they had to borrow money from private bankers and all of that, but it was a sovereign nation state, and this was one of the things that was destroyed in the French Revolution. As people know, there were, or as I mentioned, people may not know, prior to the revolution, the Catholic Church owned huge huge quantities of land in France, under the old feudal arrangements that were owned by the Catholic Church. All that land was, and property, including monasteries, churches, and all kinds of things. And they had, industry on these lands, like water mills and stuff like that. All of this was seized by the revolutionary government during the revolution when they moved to shut down the Catholic Church. All the land was seized, and it was sold off to raise money for the government. Right? They sold the land off; they didn't keep it, and most of the land was sold to essentially private bankers. There were a couple in particular who I'll mention. One is a man named Claude Perrier. Another is a man named Emmanuel Créteil. And these were financiers and sort of independent bankers who bought a lot of this land. And during the revolutionary, under these various revolutionary governments, they began to accumulate more financial wealth. It's a long story, but more and more financial power came into their hands. And the revolutionary governments, all of them, the Committee on Public Safety, the Directory, all of the governments as they rose and fell, became more and more dependent on these bankers. And eventually, under under the, I think, the consulship. This was after Napoleon set up the consulship, but it's before the empire. They still technically have a civilian government. Under the consulship, they created, the government created the Bank of France. And this was a central bank. And Créteil was named the first director of it. This was, modeled on the same system that existed in Amsterdam, in London, and elsewhere, and emerged. So as you move past 1815, France becomes part of the central banking system in Europe. Now, if you want to look at it in one way, and this is oversimplified, essentially what happened in France is they went from, a landed aristocracy prior to the French Revolution, a landed aristocracy of the aristocrats and the church, into a central banking financial aristocracy after the revolution. Now that's a simplification, but it's only partially a simplification. This is what happened, and France comes out of this, with this change in finance. Now, I want to end it there because I'm running over and I want time for discussion, but I don't want to just end it on that detail because, I would ask people to think about what I've presented here. It is the greater implications of what this meant for the United States during the Washington presidency. We'll get into next week, and into the battle that took place in America during the French Revolution. So I'm not too worried about that. We'll get into it next week. But it is also, it's very important. Because what this, at least in my mind, in examining this, what this forced me to do, I knew the French Revolution was no damn good. I've known it for a long time, but what this forced me to do was to really think about what the difference in the principles were. And it made me reflect more on the principles that underlie our own Declaration of Independence, our own Constitution that underlie our own republic. It really crystallized certain ideas in my mind, because you begin to see how evil and alien what went on in France really was. You know, going into this, it was, well, I don't want to, you know, go over the ground I already covered. But I hope people have gotten something out of this. I've gone over. I apologize, but hopefully there'll be some discussion. So I'll stop right there.